comic book series Unfamiliar has 2 volumes out that you can buy right now, so check the link in the description if you're interested. Okay, thank you, bye. Hey everybody, it's LavenderTowne, and today I'm going to talk about the most common digital art mistakes that I made that made my art look very beginner, and some ways that I found to avoid them. So the first mistake a lot of people make when they're switching to digital art is not understanding when and how to zoom. I used to always start my art zoomed in on the head and face, and then I would zoom back and want to draw the body in underneath it. Now, when you're drawing the head and face, you really end up wanting to emphasize it. It's usually like the most fun part of the drawing, especially when you're starting out. And so you're really focused on it, and then everything else is kind of like growing off of that. And it causes this effect, this weird like bobblehead situation where the body and everything underneath is kind of like trailing and much smaller than the head. It causes this bobblehead effect that instantly makes your art look a little bit more amateur, at least it did for mine. And you can see it in a lot of examples of my older art on DeviantArt. You can clearly tell that I was most fixated on drawing the head and the face kind of central in the picture, and then everything else was sort of an afterthought, and it causes their head to literally swell up and be bigger in the frame. Now, what I tend to do now, and what I recommend for most everyone, is doing a really rough sketch zoomed all the way out. The reason this is a really bad digital art mistake is because obviously in real life you kind of can't zoom in that close. You can put your face closer to the paper, I guess, and have a similar issue, but generally you're looking at the whole piece of paper, the whole canvas, right from the start when you're doing traditional art. But with digital art, it is so tempting to zoom, especially if you're not super comfortable with the tablet yet. It can make it feel like it's easier to draw, but I highly recommend when you're in this loose sketching stage, make sure that you have the proportions figured out before you zoom in and do any detailed work on the face. You can even just mark where like the eyes and the mouth are going to be without worrying about the facial expression, and really just focus at the start on making sure that your pose is all dialed, that your hands and your body and your head are proportioned the way you want them to be. Now, obviously, I still draw the heads of my characters quite large because I draw in a cartoony art style, and I used to hide behind that as an excuse when I was making this zooming mistake, but there is a definite difference. You want to be enlarging the head because it's part of your style and not because you didn't leave enough room for the body underneath. Now, obviously, if you find yourself doing this a lot, you could just grab the head and transform it down to a smaller size, but I find it's a lot more stressful, and you'll still end up with kind of a stiff pose underneath the head if you start zoomed in on the head only. A good example of this is how far away the peace sign like hand pose is on the original drawing I was doing. Because I drew her head first and then moved on to the body, I wasn't thinking about interesting ways in which her hand and her pose could sort of overlap with that upper space. But when I drew the entire pose out first and then zoomed in, I realized that I wanted those fingers to actually be higher up and overlap with like her ear and stuff. This can be a really hard habit to break, and it's embarrassing how long it took me to actually get to this point, but once you start doing this where you draw out the whole pose first and then zoom in, you might be amazed at how quickly your art seems to improve. Okay, next I want to talk about the gradient tool. Now, I feel like when you're first starting digital art and you're a beginner, it's really easy to use the gradient tool in kind of the wrong way. Obviously, there's no real rights and wrongs in art, but what I mean to say is like I thought I was using it a certain way, and I was actually doing it in a way that was sort of detrimental to my art and was not looking the way that I had it pictured in my head. So the first mistake I was making was I was using the gradient tool where it would fade from my selected color into white rather than my selected color into transparent. That's my first recommendation, is to make sure it's fading into transparent so it doesn't wash out the overall look of your drawing with all of this random like white that you didn't mean to add. The second thing that I highly recommend is not using your gradients on a normal layer, but instead using them on a multiply layer. That's one way you can make it look less like artificial and digital if that's something you're trying to avoid. So you can see on this other side, I'm actually using a gradient over all the foreground elements, everything but the sky. And this is going to cause a very subtle, warm look to everything that's up front. It will help separate her silhouette out from the sky behind her, and it will make all the colors look a little more cohesive because they're all touched by this like toasty warm color. This is a great way to use gradient, and I find that it can really add a lot, again, without it looking necessarily super digital or like very like plasticky. Sometimes you can get kind of a weird look when you're using digital tools in too like harsh of a way. So using them in this more subtle way with multiply layers can really make it look a little bit more harmonious. Now, the other thing that I used to do was actually use the gradient tool to fill in huge swaths of color without having any color underneath. I find that using the gradient tool to layer over the top of flat colors can be a little easier to control and end up with a better looking end result, at least to my personal taste. One of the big recommendations I have with this technique is to actually have cool colors as your shading, so that will be on your gradient multiply layer, and then over top of that, if you like, you can actually have a normal layer where you're going to get that full opacity effect of your gradients and just very subtly do a warm highlight over the top, and suddenly you have all this dimensionality very easily done with the gradient tool and in a subtle enough way that it's not going to have that really aggressive digital look. Here's how I did the gradients with all the flat color removed, and you can see it looks pretty crazy because these are really just being used to enhance the flat colors underneath. It's a really quick and easy way to add a lot of dimension and interest to these flat colors, and I highly recommend trying it out if you've been too afraid to play around with gradients or if you haven't been happy with the results in the past. Next, I want to talk about hard-edged objects. This is an issue I think with all beginner artists, digital or not, but I particularly struggled with this and became kind of remedial at it when I switched to digital because I did not like the look of the line tool. So almost every digital program has some kind of version of the line tool. It will make a perfectly straight line, but usually the program will make that line in a way that's very vectory. It looks very unnatural, and so I would always try to freehand hard-edged objects like swords and knives, and they would always end up looking soft because I would always have a little bit of wobble in the way that I would draw the sword or, blade, whatever it was. With certain objects, it has to be a very straight line. Otherwise, the eye will just receive this object as something that's more like soft or wiggly. And with something like a sword, it is so critical that it looks sharp. It looks like it's made of a hard material. Things like boxes and cities, there's all kinds of stuff. Robotics, where it benefits from having that sort of very precise mathematical edge. And if you love drawing from hand, that's going to be kind of tricky. It's going to be something that you maybe resist. And perhaps you're someone who's perfectly happy to use a ruler when you're drawing on paper, but the idea of using a ruler on your tablet has never crossed your mind because it seems very strange. But that is exactly what I suggest you do. If you're not happy with the line tool in your art program of choice, or if they don't have one, I recommend actually putting a straight edge thing like a book or a ruler onto your tablet and drawing from that. I swear it won't hurt it. It is a very weird and awkward kind of thing if you've never done it before, but quickly you may find that you're able to get a more naturalistic hand-drawn looking line that's perfectly straight than you can from using the line tool, and you can see the difference between these two swords that I've just drawn. I swear, I'm particularly bad at drawing straight lines. I really love to draw things that are soft and curvy. I think it's because I like to draw animals and people so much more than architecture and that kind of thing, but I swear this is what my swords used to look like. Like, they're actually like that wobbly and messy. I also didn't really know how to shade them, which only made their forms even less clear. I would usually do this like white slash and kind of a gradiated kind of smooth shading, which also makes it look soft and off and just wrong. On the other side, I looked up reference image, which is something everyone should do. It's based on this sword that was pulled out of a bog. But the most critical thing is with something like this, make sure that everything is aligned, like the sword is aligned into the hilt is aligned through the hands, and make sure that your lines are actually straight, because that will make the object that your character is holding actually look hard and sharp and like it's made out of metal. This is a recommendation I have for all kinds of inorganic objects. So definitely try it out. I mean, I know it feels weird to use a ruler on like your iPad or your tablet, but trust me, it will be a game changer. Now, sometimes being limited actually makes things easier, and in my next big digital art mistake, I think that this really embodies that. So when I draw traditionally, when I paint whatever it is, I always find myself liking the colors better than when I am painting, drawing, or illustrating digitally, and that is because I have too many options. I have infinite colors to choose from, of the highest to lowest saturation, the highest to lowest value, and as a result, if I'm not constantly being wary of myself, I end up with really whack color palettes that do not look good. So this is no joke like where my instincts would lead me a lot of the time. You can see that I am picking a lot of colors that are of a similar value, and I'll show how bad this is later. But I'm also selecting colors from a lot of different saturations all around the color wheel. There's not a lot of limitations, so I'm creating kind of a really weird color palette that doesn't really go well together. What I try to do now, I will show you next, and this is the process that I really use for drawing my comics or any kind of more serious art that I'm doing professionally. So when you're selecting your colors, you do want to limit it a little bit. You want to make sure that there is a dominant cool or warm tone generally. There are a lot of different procedures and ways that you can color your art, but for me personally, if I want to maximize clarity and make sure that the whole picture looks harmonious by the end, I try to pick a dominant like color temperature. And so for the background, I wanted the color temperature to mainly be warm tones, and I just selected them in sort of a little quadrant of the color wheel and did not let myself go beyond those areas. Then I used cool tones as a way to sort of like create some contrast, but in a more limited way. The only things that are really cool are the trees way in the background and the like bluey slate color of the character who's getting sort of taken care of in this scene. We're supposed to be looking at him, and also he is a very dark value, which I'm using to pop out the lighter tones of my primary character, who is like the veterinarian, the doctor in the scene. I know that her head is overlapping with his stomach, so I wanted to make sure that they were in an area of high contrast. I also did this with the Raven character, who is very dark, so I made sure to put their head up against the very light hill, which is also creating a sort of popping out effect because of the high contrast. You can see in the original way that I drew this that there just isn't a lot of value shift, especially when you turn it black and white. It looks kind of mushy and it's hard to know where your eyes are supposed to go. Whereas with the second one, I feel like it's pretty clear in the black and white version, this sort of punching out between the foreground, midground, and background, as well as drawing our eyes to the raven and the girl. The similar values aren't the only issue with the way that I colored the first one. I also used saturation really poorly. The characters that I want the viewer to look at are lower saturation than the background by quite a high degree. You can see that the hills and the sky are the most saturated things, and it keeps drawing our eyes away from the characters. I made sure to desaturate, especially areas that are supposed to fade back, like the sky and the farthest away hill, and make sure that the saturation was a little richer in this like raspberry tone behind our characters. It's sort of pulling the eyes into the foreground, which is where I want people to be looking in this particular panel. Okay, let's talk about the absolute plague of any digital artist. That is the little white jaggies or little white speckles that happen when you're using your fill bucket. This drives me crazy, and it's something that I still struggle with from time to time, but I have a few tips and tricks that can make it work a lot better and be something that you don't have to worry about as much. So the first thing you can do is try to make sure that your ink is a little cleaner. That includes things like tidying up between the edges of the hair and the eyes, like you just saw me erasing. I know this is a little tedious, but this can help a lot, and it can also make it easier to not forget areas while you're filling. The other thing you want to do is make sure that your tolerance is as high as you can make it without the fill bucket spilling. So this is going to be a little different in every program, but most programs do allow some control over how much the fill bucket will tolerate, just basically meaning like similarly toned colors, like a white and a cream is not going to ignore the cream. It will fill the white and the cream. So that will just make it so it's a little closer to the black line art that you're trying to fill. The other thing you can do is turn off anti-aliasing, or try turning it on. In different programs, it might affect it in different ways, and just see which one works better with your art in your program. The other thing you can do is make sure that if there is any type of area scaling in your art program, that you have that turned up a little bit. That most of the time completely fixes the problem for me. It just causes the fill to expand a tiny bit past the point that it would naturally fill, and that usually overlaps with your line art, and as long as your fill layer is below your line art, it's going to look just perfect. The last ditch effort thing you can do, if this is just totally driving you crazy, is make a layer underneath all of your flats and have some kind of similar mid-tone, like a dark red or something like that. A lot of the time that works well for me in like the face area, and just basically fill everything in. So instead of having little white jaggies, you'll have little jaggies that are a more neutral color that blends a little better. That's like your last ditch effort, but it is something that can save your drawing if you realize too late that your drawing is just littered with white speckles and you don't have time to go back and recolor it. I hope this was helpful, or at least entertaining to you guys. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Sorry for my semi-hiatus recently. I had a loss in the family, as well as I was affected by the LA fires. So I am trying to get back on my feet. In happier news, I'm going to be on a book tour in France for the first 2 weeks of February. I'll be doing book signings for the French translation hardcover omnibus version of Unfamiliar. I am so excited, it looks so beautiful. Keep an eye on Instagram and Blue Sky for more details on that, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much to my wonderful patrons and members, including Stop Spinning, Silva Soul, West Art Channel, A Playful Fawn, Prince Piplup III, Mash In It, Forco, Honey Kitten 18, Nee Nico, Novel Goblin, Lauro, Data, Lily McFarlane, Artist James, Skitten, Gold Pikachu, Among Us Skibbity, Azri Cryptid, Glee, Hoodie Doodle, River D Goblin, Gato de Luz, Goodbye Number 4, Raz Tarosh, Becca, Kobe Octo VTuber, Graveyard Moss, Grexius, Maddie Momo, The Midwestern Menace, CB, Lucia Majiki, Live Live, Ravens Crow, Zosalot, T-Hill Music, Jabber Dabber Doo, Light Julie, Kadaria, Astral Fox Art, The Expressive Poker Face, Tsubaki, Cutie Pie, Cola, JJ Jade, and of course, Blah 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 Blah.